So the title of the message is a case for Christian optimism. And the word optimism can be taken both positively and negatively. The negative form of the phrase optimism I have in mind is naive optimism. The kind of optimism that views everything through rose-colored glasses, the dreamer, the head in the clouds kind of optimism. That kind of optimism is not able to give us a realistic account of the world, and it makes it the kind of optimism that we do well to stay clear of. But lest we throw the baby out with the bathwater, I do want us to acknowledge that there is such a thing as Christian optimism. Though there is negative optimism, naive optimism, we need not to displace all kinds of optimism. We can acknowledge that there is such a thing as Christian optimism. This Christian optimism is generated through a maturing trust, conviction, excitement, longing, and dependency on the true promises that God has revealed in His holy word, the Bible. This kind of optimism is not reducible to a giddy moment of euphoria, but a measured and composed confidence, that in the end, Christ will have the prize for which He died, the inheritance of nations. To substantiate that claim, I want to point out two lessons from our passage here in Matthew 16. The first has to do with recognizing Jesus for who He really is. The second has to do with the guarantee that Jesus gave. So firstly, we want to talk about recognizing Jesus for who He really is, and then we want to talk about the guarantee that Jesus gave in this passage. So firstly, recognizing Jesus for who He really is. In verse 13, Jesus creates a bit of interest amongst His disciples by asking a question. He asks His disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Though we may miss this at first, Jesus was asking His disciples a question about the Bible. This was Bible trivia time with Jesus. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? But the question is loaded. The question, who is the Son of Man, arises from the Old Testament. How well do you know your Old Testament, is what Jesus is getting at. The Old Testament depicted the Son of Man as a global king, a divine person who would rule the nations forever. We trace this back to the book of Daniel, which says, "Behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man." And this is why Jesus picks this title. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And this Son of Man came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before Him. And to Him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples and nations and languages should serve Him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and His kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. So when Jesus asked, who do people say that the Son of Man is? He was checking the spiritual pulse of society. He's checking the spiritual pulse of society, seeing if anyone had started to form any ideas or drawn any conclusions as to who the Son of Man, who was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that peoples, nations, and languages should serve Him, could be. Had anyone started to draw any conclusions about this? Who could this Son of Man be? But Jesus is not only interested in what the general public thought about this question, if there was any clues in the wider society about who the Son of Man could be. He was deeply interested in hearing what His own disciples thought about Him as the Son of Man. By assuming the title to himself, Jesus asks them very directly and very personally, "Who do you say that I am?" And this puts the disciples on the spot. Did any of his disciples, after all this time with him, have the faintest idea, the slightest notion that their rabbi could be this globally important figure known as the Son of Man? Had any of his disciples connected the dots? Surprisingly, Peter understood what Jesus was getting at. And I do mean surprisingly. It was one of those moments when you're trying to figure out how on earth did that just happen. Some years ago, I played a couple of rounds of mini golf. And if you know anything about mini golf, the last hole is the most difficult hole of them all. But on the last hole, against all the odds, I did get a hole in one. I was genuinely surprised. I didn't know how that happened, but it did happen. And this was Peter's hole-in-one moment. This is Peter's hole-in-one moment. So far, not a single disciple had made a convincing connection between Jesus and his prophetic identity. To put it in contemporary terms, no one had yet figured out that Clark Kent is the same person as Superman. No one had figured out that Bruce Wayne is the same person as Batman. No one had yet figured out that Jesus of Nazareth is the same person as the Son of Man. And then Peter comes out with this gem. Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." How on earth did that happen? How on earth does Peter come out with a gem like that when hundreds, if not thousands of others had not yet figured it out? How does he do it? And Jesus answers this question for us, doesn't he? It wasn't a lucky guess, and it wasn't a fortuitous slip of the tongue that landed Peter with the correct answer. Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Jesus would have us understand that the surprising thing here is not so much that Peter figured out Jesus' prophetic identity, but that this knowledge was revealed to him by God the Father. That is to say, to recognize Jesus for who he really is a gift from God. If you know that Jesus is the Christ, you have received a gift from God. It is a gift when we figure this identity of Jesus out. In practical terms, this is a huge step in the direction of Christian optimism. If God has the liberty to reveal this insight and understanding to people, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of Man, with everlasting dominion, we have every reason to feel some sense of Christian optimism. Suddenly, all of a sudden, every person that you meet, the person that you have known for 30 years and the neighbor that you only met last week, every person that you meet suddenly becomes a potential candidate for the Christian faith. Knowing that God possesses the liberty and power to impress upon people the true identity of Jesus generates Christian optimism. It generates the kind of optimism that makes us more willing to share our faith. Because in that moment, it could be that God will impress upon that person that you are speaking to the true identity of Jesus of Nazareth. It could happen right in front of your eyes. And that is a huge step toward Christian optimism. So in this teaching, we are shown that becoming a Christian is not left to blind luck or ultimately even dependent upon our persuasive powers, but to God, who has unstoppably purposed to redeem for himself a people like Peter to the praise of his wisdom and grace. So that is one cause or one reason for Christian optimism, that God has the power to reveal the identity of the Christ to whomever, whenever. But shifting now from how people come to recognize Jesus' true identity, we find further cause for Christian optimism when we look at the particular guarantee that Jesus gave. Come down to verse 18. Jesus is talking here and he says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." It is true that very few verses in the Bible have attracted more controversy than these, especially the words, "On this rock I will build my church." There is controversy because there are strongly competing views about the identity of this rock on which Jesus intends to build his church. There is controversy within the Christian world, within Christendom, about who or what this rock is. One view is found in Roman Catholic doctrine, which asserts that Peter is the rock. Peter is the rock, meaning Peter is the foundational leader, the founding father, the first pope of the Christian church. In contrast to this, Protestants like myself don't see this teaching of Peter as the rock of the church in Jesus' words. Indeed, Protestants don't see this rock-like strength in Peter, who only a few verses later would conspire with the devil to resist Jesus' mission of suffering and atoning death for his people. We just don't see that kind of rock-like strength in Peter. He is not able to sustain the weight of a church being built upon him. So I submit to you, this rock Jesus talked about was connected with Peter, but it's not Peter himself. The rock is Peter's confession, the truth that Jesus is the Christ. That is the rock on which the Christian church is built. The confession that Peter makes is the rock on which the church is built. And that confession is that Jesus is the Christ. So setting aside this brief excursion, I do want us to focus upon Jesus' words, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." There is Christian optimism baked into these words. The optimism that I'm talking about is baked into these words. The endurance of the church is what Jesus, the Lord with everlasting dominion, has guaranteed. He has made the personal guarantee that he will build his church and that his church will endure. And as we think about this guarantee, it's helpful to know what Jesus meant by church. Perhaps when we think about what a church is, some of us think about a church building, perhaps a particular denomination, or even an individual congregation. And these may all be well and good, but what Jesus primarily had in mind here was God's people gathered throughout time, what we call the church universal. The church universal is what's being talked about here. This is what we confess in the Apostles' Creed. When we confess that we believe in the Holy Catholic Church, we do not mean that we believe in the Roman Catholic Church, but a holy universal church. That's what small c Catholic means. It is a universal church, a whole faithful church across time and throughout the world. That is what the Catholic Church is. With this in mind, look again at Jesus' words, I will build my church. The word church here is, of course, ecclesia, meaning an assembly or a congregation. Think about that. Think about the word that Jesus used there. It is by definition and by nature, church is a gathered people by God and for God. Church is a gathered people by definition, by nature, by God and for God. This is what our gatherings weekly on the Lord's Day signifies. Here, because you have come here, you are showing to the world, you are expressing to the world that you belong in a microcosm form to a much larger truth. You are here gathered because you are the church, and this is a microcosm of a much larger truth, that we are part of the universal church that Jesus has guaranteed to build. This is what we signify by gathering. And verse 18 also furthers the case for Christian optimism when Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, the question is, what are we dealing with here? What on earth are the gates of hell? The word hell here is an unfortunate translation. It is an unfortunate translation. For many of us, this conjures up medieval images of a pitchfork devil tormenting people in a burning lava lake. That is generally the kind of like caricature of hell that many of us possess. However, I think it better to keep the Greek word Hades here, and that may be footnoted in a number of your Bibles, because it's not strictly hell as we might typically think of it. This is not the kind of hell that we typically think of, the burning lava lake kind of hell. Scholar and pastor Kevin DeYoung explained that people of Jesus' time understood the gates of Hades represented the gateway from this life to the grave. That is what Hades is. It is the gateway from this life to the grave. It is the fate from which no one can escape. It is the event horizon from which no one comes back. The thinking here is, build your church all you want, Jesus. Build your church all you want. But eventually, death will devour it. And time will bury it, just as it does everything else. So what guarantee was Jesus making when he said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it? What kind of guarantee is that, if death and time will bury it like everything else? Jesus was pushing back against the pessimism that death has to have the final word on everything by giving this strong guarantee that not even a devouring power like death can stop his church from enduring. Jesus is pushing back on that pessimism that death has to have the final word on everything that we do or say or experience. And he pushes back and he says, look, listen to my guarantee. Listen closely. Not even the devouring power of death will hold back my church from enduring. Now, you can either take Jesus for a fool who overplayed his hand here, a religious salesman who overpromised but cannot deliver, or you could take a look at the church throughout history, and as imperfect as she may be, consider this. Empires have tried to crush her. Internal schisms have tried to tear her to pieces. But throughout it all, she has survived. And not only has she survived, against all expectation, she is still growing. She is still growing. Let me read to you a small excerpt from a highly influential news publisher that came out in very recent years. This from the Washington Post, not a sympathizer of Christianity, by the way. Over the past 100 years, Christians grew from less than 10% of Africa's population to nearly 500 million today. 1 out of 4 Christians in the world presently is in Africa. Asia is also experiencing growth. In the last century, Christians grew at twice the rate of population in that continent. Asia's Christian population of 350 million is projected to grow to 460 million by next year. From 360 million to 460 million within this year. The global religious wildcard is China. Even today, demographers estimate that more Christian believers are found worshiping in China on any given Sunday than in the United States combined. Incredible, isn't it? That she is still growing. That the Lord is still growing his church at quite a rate of knots. Think about things locally. Think about New Zealand, right? 200 years ago, only 200 years ago, there was no established churches here in this land. Now there are thousands. Within 200 years, the church here has gone from no established church to thousands. Is this not a cause for Christian optimism about Jesus making good on his ancient but true guarantee that he will build his church, and not even death itself is able to restrain him from building his church, as he is fully committed to do? Now, let me cut to the chase. The church endures and grows because she has been given a set of keys labeled gospel. The church grows and endures because she has been given a set of keys with the tag on it called gospel. Look at verse 19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. What these keys do is clarified by the phrase binding and loosing. The keys that Jesus gives his church, what they do, their function, is explained by the phrase bound and loosed. Binding and loosing has to do with forbidding and permitting entry into the kingdom of heaven. This is what gospel keys do. They permit someone to the kingdom or forbid someone from entry to the kingdom. So whenever Jesus is proclaimed as the Christ, who lived and died and rose again from the dead to pardon sinners from the wrath of God, and all of this is believed as the exceedingly gracious redemption plan of God, people are permitted to the kingdom. Whenever that gospel is disbelieved, people are excluded from the kingdom. These are the keys given to the church. We proclaim Jesus crucified for sinners and welcome all who believe. These are our keys that we wield week in and week out. So maybe what was said today has helped us think about Christian optimism as we start a new year. Maybe this has helped elevate your eyes a little higher off the horizon, looking for good things from the Lord in the years ahead. It is not an optimism that refuses to deal with the real and hard realities of the world, the sin, the suffering, the disorder, the distaste for the kingdom of God. But this Christian optimism, rooted in specifics which God has revealed in His Word, summons us to at least consider that God is at work, causing people to recognize Jesus as the Christ, that Christ will build an enduring church, and that 2,000 years of history bears witness to His guarantee. It is worth our response, I believe, of a measured and composed optimism. Let's pray.